Hello, everyone. Welcome back. Uh, this chapter is chapter 4, the market forces of supply and demand. Now, before we begin, first let's talk about what led us here. Up to this chapter, we talked about engagements between different countries, and in order to keep it simple, we assume that people don't make decisions themselves. There is someone at the top, a single decision maker. We often call him a benevolent dictator or social planner or social optimizer. These are many names for this setup. But now we are getting more realistic because people actually make decisions for themselves. People are rational, smart, they want something, they demand something, and they also produce something. They make a decision on what to make. Am I going to build a laptop, or am I going to be a tablet, or only a smartphone? That depends on what I plan to sell to the consumers, and that also that depends on what I expect the consumers would need or demand. So supply and demand, two different decision strategies that are made by rational people using their rationality and expectations. Now we are trying to introduce people making decisions for themselves. Markets and competition. Remember, we talked about in chapter 1, market, a group of buyers and sellers of a particular good or service. Buyers as a group, they determine the demand for the product, and sellers as a group, they determine the supply of that product. A competitive market, it's a form of market that we assume in this kind of market, there are so many, in close to infinite number of buyers and sellers. The reason we assume this is that we want to assume that no single buyer or no single seller has enough power to influence the market, impact the price. So no one has market power. For example, when you enroll in a university and you want to pay your tuition, because there are so many students, you don't have a say in paying your tuition or how much tuition do you want to pay. You cannot negotiate with the school. Or when you want to buy an iPhone, you cannot actually negotiate. This is because we assume there are so many of us, the consumers, we don't have market power. Now, in a perfectly competitive market, there are also so many suppliers that suppliers cannot also negotiate prices here. Each has a negligible impact on market price. A perfectly competitive market also means that all the goods are the same. So you don't have quality here. You don't have, let's say, a brand new iPhone and let's say an older model. All the goods are just smartphones. They're all the same. All goods are exactly the same. Buyers and sellers are so numerous that no one can affect the market price. This setup is also called price taker in comparison with price giver. In a monopoly, when there is only one seller or one buyer, that seller or buyer can negotiate prices because of market power. In that case, we say the individual has market power and therefore is a price giver. I decide on what price I'm going to sell my good to maximize my profits. But in a perfectly competitive market, we assume because there are so many buyers on this side and so many sellers on the other side, no one has any market power. So for all price takers, price is only decided by the dynamics of the market itself, and we just accept whatever price the market gives us. Yeah, demand. Demand, amount of a good that buyers are willing and able to purchase. For example, how many hamburgers do I want to eat? That depends on my lifestyle. That depends on how much hungry I am. That also depends on how much money I have. So there are different things affecting our demand, our preference, our budget, our expectations of the future. All of these are important. Law of demand, other things equal, when the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of the good falls. So if we assume everything else stays the same, my preferences doesn't change, my budget doesn't change, anything about me doesn't change. Law of demand tells us when something is more expensive, I will consume less of it. Another example, for example, every time I go, let's say, to McDonald's, I would order three Big Macs. But then if the price goes up next time, I won't order three Big Macs as usual. I would only order two. When the price of a good rises, the quantity demanded of that good falls. When the price falls, on the other hand, the quantity demanded rises. It makes perfect sense. This is an example. Sam's demand schedule. A table shows the relationship between the price of a good and the quantity demanded. Sam's demand for lattes. Notice that Sam's preferences obey the law of demand. When lattes are free, Sam will approach 16 number of lattes demanded. That means Sam can at maximum drink 16 cups of coffee before Sam's end up in a hospital and gets sick or something. When the price is $1, Sam will only order 14 cups of coffee. At $2.12, and as the price goes up, Sam would consume less and less and less coffee, or fewer cups of lattes. At price is $6, Sam will only consume 4 lattes. Now, we draw this curve using the information that we had. 0 goes to our 16. 1, 2, 3, 4. As the price of lattes rise, you can see that we're falling back on the curve. The quantity of lattes goes back. This is a demand curve. Demand curve almost always is like this. It starts from above, comes down. It has a negative slope. Remember this, demand curve falling down. Because as we move on the quantity curve, on the quantity axis, price must comes down. That's the law of demand. And the opposite, as the price goes up, our quantity goes down. Again, law of demand. Law of demand implies a negative slope value. Now, demand. Market demand, sum of all individual demands for a good or service. Market demand curve, sum the individual demand curve horizontally. To find the total quantity demanded at any price, you just add all the individual demands, individual quantities together. You can see here that we say, for example, we only have 2 buyers in this market, Sam and Dean. We just add each of their individual demand at a certain price together, and then we have our market demand. Why do we care about the market demand? Because as a producer, you want to have a really good estimation of how many goods your consumers, your customers are willing to buy to prepare for it. Because before, let's say, before the school year begins, university needs to know how many students will enroll in EC202 classes, because then the university needs to decide how many teachers to hire or assign to different classes. So What they do is that they sum of the demand for every individual group, for example, accounting majors, economic majors, business administration majors, fashion and textile industry majors, computer engineering majors, they all are put together. And now we have a pool of market demand. Then we can understand, okay, 40 students for each class, then we need like 6 teachers. Market demand is very important because as a producer, you want to plan ahead. How many employers do I need to hire? Or in a tragic situation, how many employees do I need to fire? That's also important. How many how much machinery do I need to buy? How many trucks do I need for my transportation? How many computers do I need for my staff? Insurance, electricity bills. How many, let's say, workshops do I need to rent? These are all important things that you need to know the market demand to be able to prepare for. The market demand curve for lattes, as you can see, that's the total. We're not talking about the individual demand anymore. Now we added all our expected customers' behaviors together. Now we have Dean and the other one was Sam. We put Sam and Dean together and we have our market demand. Now, demand curve would change because people change. We're no longer talking about dictators sitting at the top of a country deciding stuff for everybody. Like we use the example of the president of the United States and the emperor of Japan engaging trade between the two countries. Now we're talking about smart people individually making decisions for themselves. In these circumstances, things constantly are changing. So, as a producer, you need to be able to respond rapidly. And that's why we study demand curve shifters. Demand curve shows how price affects quantity demanded, other things being equal. These other things, very important exam, important stuff here. These other things are non-price determinants of demand. Things that determine buyers' demand for a good other than the good's price. So the curve itself, it shows us at what price, how many you would sell. But then if something other than price changes, the demand curve itself needs to change. For example, something goes out of fashion, especially if you're like into like fashion major, you would know that probably fashion industry and clothing industry very suspect. Oh my god, my brain just went. Very sensitive to demand curve shifters. Your your industry is very sensitive to demand curve shifters. For example, something is fashionable this year, everybody is crazy about it, they're all going to buy it, but then next year you all introduce a new fashion. Now no one wants to buy what was selling like crazy last year. This year no one is buying it. That's why when you go to all these retailers, you see on their clearances lots of old, not really old, for like a year ago. They're getting like 50% discount, sometimes 75% discount. Why? Because the store owners knows people no longer want this. They just want to get rid of it so that they can have space for the new fashionable items. These are non-price determinants. People change their desires and their preferences. For example, another example, you're in producing of milk, you're producing milk. For all the years, we all thought that milk is really good for us. We said milk is full of calcium and all, like potassium. I'm not really sure. I don't remember. But then time passed, we had like new research showing up saying that milk is not really that good. There are things that milk can do to your body. And a little more time passed by, these researchers piled up on each other. They said, oh, milk is actually bad for you. Don't drink milk. Some other people said, drink milk. Some said, don't drink milk. This made the market to shift its demand. People who were really interested in consuming milk, they suddenly changed. Some of them said, perhaps milk is not really good for us. Let's switch to, let's say, almond milk or something like that. That made the demand curve change. Price didn't change here. Price didn't change here. There was no change in price. There was a change in a non-price factor, the preference of your consumers. Changes in these factors shift the demand curve. Now, number of buyers is one of these the most important factors. Increase in number of buyers, which shift the demand curve like this, increase the quantity demanded at each price, shifts the demand curve to the right. Decrease in number of buyers would decrease the quantity demanded at each price, shifts the demand curve to the left. Why? Because when the number of buyers go up, that means that the producer can now sell the more sell more quantities at this same price. Why? Because now more people want this good, and the opposite holds for decreasing the number of buyers. You can see here, let's say the number of buyers, let's say this is a t-shirt market, the market for t-shirts. And now one more person from here all the way here, one more person entered the market. This one more person also needs to buy a shirt because you can't go anywhere shirtless. So now you have to buy a shirt for yourself. Now you're added to the pool of all other people consuming shirts from 0 to 25, let's call it like 24 or something. All these folks were buying t-shirts, but now one more person entered the market. That one more person would consume exactly like the rest of them. This would move the curve to the right. Demand curve shifters, also income. When people are richer, they can consume more. This is a very important thing. Normal good, other things constant. An increase in income leads to an increase in demand, shifts the demand curve to the right. This is for normal goods. Normal goods are almost every good, but there are some goods that are considered inferior goods. These goods are they're preferred by low-income individuals. These are the goods that low-income individuals consume a lot of it. For example, one example that constantly used by economists is fast food, hamburgers. People who are low income, they won't go to high fancy restaurants and order $50 steaks. They would go to McDonald's and order $5 Big Mac. But if these people become richer and richer and their income goes up, they will go to McDonald's less and less, and they go to that high-end restaurant more and more. So McDonald's could be considered an inferior good for some people. Inferior good, other things being constant, an increase in income leads to a decrease in demand, shifts the demand curve to the left. Now, where I come from, we consider bread and eggs inferior goods because a low income population a huge portion of their diets are made of bread and eggs. And if the country's income goes up and people actually become richer and richer, more people will shift their diet from breads and eggs to, let's say, beef and chicken and other more expensive food stuff. Also, bus tickets. As more and more people become richer and their income goes up, more people will buy a car for themselves and stop using the bus service. Of course, this is like in a general situation. In many huge urban areas, you're even if you have like 5 cars in your garage, you still won't drive because the traffic makes you really annoyed. So you just take the bus, use public transportation. They're using the example of, let's say, a city or like Raleigh or a general area, we assume. Now, another demand curve shifter, prices of related goods, substitutes. Different goods sometimes are substitutes. For example, let's say an example. Two goods are substitutes if an increase in the price of one leads to an increase in the demand for other. Let's say two goods that are substitutes. Smartphones and tablets. They can be considered as substitutes. Why? Because they're both electronic devices that you can use to process information on, and they're both compact and mobile. You can carry them with yourself. Of course, there are some differences between the two, but they usually are very close to each other as substitutes. Now, what happens if the price of smartphones suddenly triples? If your phone goes from being, let's say, $500 to $1,500, then in this situation, you would say, okay, I'm not going to pay $1,500 for a phone. I'm just going to buy myself a tablet or an iPad, something like that. It's bigger. I know it's less mobile, but it still can use it to process information, watch a cat video on YouTube, watch my teacher's emails, read my teacher's emails, some important things, leisure, every other use that we have for without mobile electronic devices. So two goods are substitutes. If an increase in price of one means an increase in the demand for other. What does it mean? It means when two goods can be substitutes, if price of one goes up, some consumers from here, they would say, okay, I've had enough, I'm moving here to this area. People who used to buy smartphones, if the price of smartphones goes up, they would say, oh, I don't need to buy a smartphone. I'll just move to the tablet industry. I'll buy myself a tablet. Pizzas and hamburgers. Pizzas, price goes up, people would say, okay, I'm not going to order a pizza for myself tonight. I'm just going to buy and get hamburgers, Big Macs. Other examples, Coke and Pepsi, laptops and tablets. Yeah, laptop was a better example than smartphones. Music CDs and music downloads. Now, two substitutes are not exactly the same. They have their differences, but they could be interchangeable. They could be. For example, I know people that would call 911 if you tell them Coke and Pepsi are the same. Each brand has its own tribe of loyal customers. But then, if price of Coke's triple or goes up by tenfold, you can expect that many Coke customers would move towards consumption of Pepsi. The same goes for other substitute goods. Other things, we had substitutes. We also have complements. Complements are two goods that complete each other. Now, substitutes are two goods that can be substituted with one another. Complements are two goods that need to work together to do a task. For example, a computer has a keyboard, a mouse, probably speakers, a display, graphic card, CPU, hard drive. All of these are complements. They're all sold separately on the market. For example, if my mouse breaks down, I will have to buy another mouse. Otherwise, my keyboard alone wouldn't be so much effective. It would be near. If my hard drive breaks down, I actually have to buy a new hard drive because my PC would be completely useless until I have another hard drive or another CPU. So complements are goods that have to be there together so that you can use them. Now, when goods are complements, an increase in price of one good will also will reduce the demand for other goods as well. Why? Because let's say I want to buy myself a PC. Then the price of a brand new optic mouse goes up tenfold, hundredfold. Then I would say, okay, I don't need a PC. I'm just going to buy a laptop or a tablet where I can use the touchpad or the touch screen. Some people are always on the border. They're undecided. Do I really need a PC? Yeah, I should probably buy a PC. But then when prices change in certain parts of a PC, now they have a reason to shift it. Other goods. That means when the price of a mouse goes up, some people who were on the border of buying a PC no longer have a valid reason to buy a PC. So they would move to buy, let's say, a laptop or a tablet. What does that mean? That means less people will also be buying a keyboard. So an increase in the price of a mouse will reduce the demand for keyboards as well. Computers and software. That's a very important example. If price of computers rises, people buy fewer computers, and therefore people will buy less software to install on these computers. Software demand curve shifts to the left. Other examples are college tuition and textbooks. Textbooks, we all know they cost a lot of money. Trust me, I myself as a student really have to be worried about my textbooks, like especially when you get to that like high-end statistics and things like that. Some textbooks are like $300, $400, and every course you need like 5 different textbooks. So we're talking about like half of our tuition just for textbooks. But then when tuition goes up and up and up, at one point I realized that the school doesn't really worth my time. Education is an investment. You invest some money in the education and you expect a return. But then as the investment goes up, and the return stays the same, at one point someone would say, it's not rational for me to go to school anymore. I should drop out, go to work. When I make that decision, I will no longer pay college tuition to the school, and also I will no longer purchase textbooks. So if college tuitions go up and up and up, at the same rate, textbook demand would come down, down, down. Demand curve shifts to the left. Now, very important, tastes, fashion. Something that's fashionable today would sell really nice. But if next year it goes out of fashion, It wouldn't sell that much. Anything that causes a shift in tastes toward a good will increase demand for that good and shifts its demand curve to the right. Many works of research, for example, if I write a paper and I say, okay, my data, my research, my analysis shows that, let's say, Pepsi is good for you, then more people who are consuming Cokes will move to buy more Pepsis. That would shift the demand curve for Pepsi to the right. If you think about it, all of these we've covered so far make perfect sense. The Atkins diet became popular in the 90s because an increase in demand for eggs shifted the egg demand curve to the right. Atkins diet is heavily focused on eggs. So when people decided, okay, we're going to be healthier or it's cooler or all these other different reasons that we have to decide what's our taste, then people started to move towards this Atkins diets. And in order to be able to use the Atkins diets, they need to purchase more and more eggs. This made the demand curve for eggs shift to the right. Very important, expectations about the future. Expect an increase in income, increase in current demand. Expect higher prices, increase in current demand. Now, expectation is what I believe will happen in future, and I would prepare myself accordingly. Expectations about the future, if you expect that in future you're going to be rich, you're more likely to increase current demand. One reason that many graduate students are so much in debt is because they expect that after they graduate, they would find a really high paying or decent paying jobs. So they don't need to really be worried right now. They can consume, they can enjoy a lifestyle that on a salary of a graduate salary, for example, would have been impossible, wouldn't be sustainable. If someone tells me that you're going to stay a graduate student until your last day, 50 years from now, I would say, okay, then I can no longer afford the current lifestyle that I have. My lifestyle wouldn't be sustainable. The only reason that I have the lifestyle that I have now is because I know it's temporary. I'm expecting that in 2 years, I'll graduate and then I can find myself a decent paying job to pay back my debt and keep on living the lifestyle that I'd like to. These are all about my expectation. Currently, graduate students' income can only sustain a certain different low income lifestyle on its own. But the graduate student knows that it's temporary. It's temporarily. Expectations about the future implies that in future, this graduate student will become richer. If people expect their incomes to rise, their demand curve for meals at expensive restaurants increase now. Now, variables that influence buyers, price of the good itself represents a movement along the demand curve. A variable, the price variable, when price changes, you don't shift the demand curve because demand curve itself shows you the changes of price and the changes of quantities responding to that change of price. So when the price of a good itself changes, you just move along the demand curve. But when non-price factors change, you shift the demand curve. Make sure you know how each one of these shifters work. These are important and very important, like definitely exam question. And also make sure that you know an example because they all use common sense. If you think about it, it makes perfect sense that, for example, when the price of a mouse goes up, people would buy less keyboards because less people would be willing to buy a computer in total. Yeah. Okay, here's we're going to pause for part one. See you in part two, and we'll work together on active learning one.